Hello, my name is Adam Potter, and this is my Missional Helix presentation for MIS 6550. What we're going to look at here today is adapting the model of the Missional Helix a little bit so it can be used for strategy formation and strategy evaluation. The way that this model will be adapted means that you can take an existing strategy and kind of run it through the model and see how it fares, or you can use it as a guide to creating an initial strategy for any sort of problem that you might deal with in church planting. So here's the missional helix as presented in the lectures. It begins with theological formation, moves into historical analysis, down to cultural analysis, and that kind of flows into strategy formation. The model kind of works in a circular fashion. Crank it around like this, and the end result is your strategy. I think also in the lectures, at each stage, missions activity or some sort of ministry activity kind of spun off of it. So I think this is a great model. It has some really good strengths, but it does have a couple of weaknesses. Let's consider the strengths first. It combines cultural analysis with theology. I think this is really important. If you care only about culture, you're going to be pretty pragmatic. You're going to kind of go into church planting or some part of ministry and say, well, whatever works, we're going to do it. Whatever the culture demands, we're going to acquiesce. And this is not a biblical position and not really a helpful position either. Secondly, you could be the kind of the hopeless romantic theologian who can never quite connect his theology or his ecclesiology with what's happening in the lives of the people that he's there to reach or she's there to reach. So this model would help prevent that by looking at history, culture, and theology. Secondly, it uses history as a guide for the future. You know, a strength of millennials and 20-somethings right now is just their entrepreneurial spirit, their desire to go and do new things. But it kind of cuts both ways. A weakness of that position might be that we don't always take into account the many years of successes and failures that those who have gone before us have endured and have triumphed. So we want to be people who are wise, who consider the outcome of our leaders' way of faith, you know, as Hebrews says, and imitate their faith, consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. We want to be people who look at the past and use that as a guide for the future. So this allows us to do that. And secondly, it can be used for so many different problems. It can be used for solving many different problems. While it has a few great strengths, it does have a couple of pronounced weaknesses. First and foremost, it doesn't account for where theological formation comes from. If I have a teammate, or let's say I'm a missionary overseas and I have a teammate that I'm working with trying to figure out a strategy, or someone on my core team, church planting, if we have differing perspectives theologically, we can't really use the model to come to the same place. We have to account for where our theology comes from. We can't assume that we would have the same theological formation. Different people, different paths, different education. Secondly, it doesn't really specify which input is most important. The model could, the user bias could cause you to overemphasize history, what's happened in the past. Either this happened in the past, so we never want to do this, or this worked in the past, so we're only going to do this. Or you might find someone who's maybe a little overly obsessed with culture and just is kind of a slave to whatever the current trends of culture are, and they neglect their theological formation or the historical analysis portion. Secondly, and I'll explain this a little bit more a few slides from now, I think the strategy formation portion is a little oversimplified. I think there's some important delineation that needs to be made there, so we'll look at that here in just a minute. So here's some solutions in response to the weaknesses. We could add a step for biblical interpretation. That would be before theological formation. We'd expand the strategy formation portion and make it more detailed. And we'd just add a focus on the Pauline cycle, just to make the model kind of show what part of the church planting cycle that we see in the book of Acts and that has been written on extensively by Hesselgrave and others. We need to be able to see the results of the helix as it relates to where we are in church planting. And thirdly, you make the model linear, and that allows for biblical interpretation and theological formation to be foundational rather than just an element. All right, so with the strengths and weaknesses in mind, here's the project objective. We'll make key additions to the Missional Helix, and we'll apply the adapted model to 3 issues that church planners could face. These are just going to be hypotheticals that will allow us to show how the model works. All right, so first let's take a look at the model, and then we'll kind of apply it to the 3 hypothetical situations. Up here you can see that we added biblical interpretation. So if I'm working with a teammate, a coworker, a friend, and we have a difference in theology, then we need to back up to biblical interpretation, and we need to try and get on the same page, or at least understand exactly where our differences are, so that it's not a he said, she said situation. This would be huge for a core team or missions team, just so you can be on the same page and so you can kind of rightly discuss the different issues associated with strategy formation. Then right here in the middle is the traditional missional helix right here. This would be strategy formation here. So this is the original model. What you see in the beginning and the end is the additions. You work down through these steps and you get to people group strategy. Now this could be a people group strategy for like overseas missions context, or it could be a city strategy or a neighborhood strategy, but it's basically just the overall strategy of reaching all of the people who are like the people you're trying to reach. It moves into teaming and individual strategy. This is important because it shows that maybe there's a lot of things that need to be done in this city. A lot of lost sense that needs to be reached, a lot of different categories of people, types of people, and it's not realistic to think that I am going to reach them all. So out of this whole strategy, what am I going to do? So that allows me to say no to a lot of great things so that I can do what I think God's called me to do, but it also leaves the door open for me to look for people who could do other parts of the strategy to see my city reached, or other parts of the strategy to see my people group reached. Once your team knows what it's going to do, what about me? Day to day, what am I going to do? What are my strengths and gifting? So out of this strategy and this teaming strategy, what's the individual going to do? Finally, we move into an execution and evaluation portion. And down below you see this is the just biblical model for church planting found in the book of Acts: entry, evangelism, church formation, leadership development, and exit strategy. All right, so we're going to take this model and we're going to apply it to 3 different situations. The first is, let's say a family. A guy wants to church plant bivocationally, wants to do it simply, wants to move to, say, a Baltimore or a Boston or a New York or someplace by himself, church planting without a team. Second, let's say someone wants to do a tent revival strategy for evangelism. We're going to look at that. And then third, a church planter wants to have a process for elder development. So we're going to take a look at that. All right, bivocational church planting alone. When you have a problem or a strategy that you're evaluating, this model kind of requires you to ask some questions. What is the biblical example? Is there any wise counsel from history and culture? Should this be done in your city, people group, neighborhood? Should you be the one doing it? That's that individual team quotient. And then how will you execute? So biblical example, for the bivocational part of this, this really has two sections. First is bivocational, second is doing it alone. Book of Acts shows us the same person, Apostle Paul, doing it both ways. So that's where tent making came from, but Paul was really only a tent maker for a limited portion of his ministry. As soon as he was able to be supported in one situation, he immediately stopped and did ministry or word full time. So biblical example is going to show you that both are good and normal for followers of Christ to do. Theologically, it's basically the same. Your church planting, however you get to where you're going, that seems to be allowable from the Word of God. History, Dr. Dodson shared near the beginning of class this semester that church planting alone is not smart. He doesn't advise it. It's probably because in the past it's gone poorly. Culturally, you can definitely see some strengths and weaknesses. Most hard cultures to penetrate, whether it's a city or a people group, take a lot of time and energy to understand the culture. But jobs can provide you not just funding, but access. If you're working in a context where sharing the gospel and planting churches is illegal, you'll need a vocational identity to allow you to stay among the people, so it's completely necessary. This is where this portion could push you one way or the other. And finally, you might say, you might see, hey, I think my city needs this. Lots of bivocational church planters doing their own thing, but maybe I'm not the person to do it. Maybe I am. So possible conclusions. Biblical example points to teaming. You should really focus on that. Church planting like this may have been successful in the past, but it's not the norm. Maybe you say, hey, I think this is for me. Maybe someone else would be better suited for this. All right, tent revival evangelism. The biblical example is bold public evangelism in the book of Acts. We don't ever need to think that that was just a cultural thing, that people were willing to listen to that, because many of our heroes of the faith were persecuted heavily for their bold public evangelism. So it wasn't that everyone was cool with it, but that's the example we see. That should feed into our theology. Historical analysis, man, this has worked in the past. Billy Graham type stuff, all kinds of evangelists have done this. Here's where you might find a roadblock here culturally. Is this still something that people would respond to? That would really depend on your context. Is this an urban context, a post-Christian context, or what? Is it a place in the deep South where it actually might be a kind of a cool throwback event that people might really appreciate and might respond to? Secondly, you might say, hey, this is something I want to do, but who should do it? Maybe I'm not the type of pastor that is a fiery revival guy. Maybe I need to bring someone in if I'm going to do this. And then how are you going to do it? So, biblical example, yes, we see bold, abundant gospel preaching. They've been successful in the past. This could probably still be done in some areas. Probably a bad choice for urban or post-Christian environments, but could be a good choice in the right context. And thirdly, elder leadership development in church planting. What's the biblical example? Well, it seems to be from the book of Acts that for the most part, leaders of local churches come from the harvest. They don't come from the apostolic work. So the Bible's really clear that that's the expectation. So you want to be careful about doing something like bringing all of your elders for the next 20 years at your church with you on the core team. It's not close to the biblical example. History and culture, bringing elders with you has worked in the U.S. I don't know if it's really multiplied a lot in the U.S., but it's definitely been successful here. And then when you're enacting a leadership development plan, am I the guy that needs to be in charge of this, or is there someone else that would be better? I think that would be an important thing to ask, because you know your team's going to be doing this. If you're planning a church, you got to develop elders. All right, so here's just some possible conclusions. New Testament examples, leaders being raised from the harvest. You need to figure out, is this descriptive or prescriptive? Is this something that we need to mimic or just use as a kind of a reference point? Theologically, this creates true disciple-making, reproducing model of church planting. Do we want to emulate this? If so, how's our team going to do this together? Here's some final conclusions. When it comes to figuring out how to form strategy, use a model that prioritizes biblical interpretation as a foundation. Realize that real work comes when applying right interpretation, even if your methods aren't the way we've always done it. So biblical interpretation takes precedence. You can use this model when talking with teammates and fellow workers in your context. It can help you figure out where differences of opinion are coming from. If someone thinks they should be doing something, these questions, should we do this another way? Let's do this because it worked over here. All Bible-believing Christians should do it this way. These type of questions, you can figure out where the difference of opinion is coming from and address that with this model. So I hope this is helpful. Let me know what you think and how you plan to use this in the future.